industry distributed. The Industrial Revolution was a series of improvements in industrial technology that transformed the process of manufacturing goods. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was a home-based manufacturing, which was known as the cottage industry. Industry is concentrated in 3 of the 9 world regions: Europe, North America, and East Asia. Iron was the first to benefit from the Watt steam engine. Coal became the principal source of energy to operate the ovens and the steam engines. Transportation, first canals and then railroads, enabled factories to attract a large number of workers, bring in bulky raw materials such as iron ore, and ship finished goods to consumers. Textiles transformed from a dispersed cottage industry to a concentrated factory system during the late 18th century. Spinning frames were placed near sources of rapidly flowing water. Chemicals like bleach and dye were made. Virtually all was useful for dyeing clothing. Food processing. Canned food was essential to feed the factory workers who no longer worked on farms. UK dominated world production of steel in the 19th century. Rhine River Valley has a concentration of steel and iron because it's close to large coal fields. Mid-Rhine is Europe's most centrally located industrial area. Poelbassen attracted textiles and other industries because of numerous workers willing to accept lower wages and inexpensive hydroelectricity. Northeastern Spain, Europe's fastest-growing manufacturing area during the late 20th century. Moscow, Russia's oldest industrial region, centered around the country's capital and largest city. St. Petersburg, Russia's second-largest city, and it specializes in shipbuilding. The Urals contain the world's most varied collection of minerals. Volga, region containing Russia's largest petroleum and natural gas fields. Kuznets contains Russia's largest reserves of coal and abundant supply of iron ore. Donetsk, eastern Ukraine, had world's largest coal reserves. Silesia, rapidly growing area with skilled low-paid workforce. New England was a cotton textile center in the early 19th century. The Middle Atlantic is the largest U.S. market and is close proximity to a large number of consumers. The Mohawk Valley, a linear industrial belt in the upper New York State, takes advantage of inexpensive electricity. Pittsburgh Lake area was a leading steel-producing area. The Western Great Lakes, centered on Chicago, is the hub of the nation's transportation network and is now the center of steel production. Southern California is now the country's largest area of clothing and textile production and a major food processing center. Southeastern Ontario, Canada's most important industrial area, is central to Canadian and U.S. markets. Japan became an industrial power in the 1950s and 60s. Manufacturing is concentrated in the central region between Tokyo and Nagasaki. China has the world's largest supply of low-cost labor and is the world's largest market for many consumer products. South Korea, the country, is the leading producer of ocean-going ships. Manufacturing is centered along the rim of the country.
Key issue 2. Why are situation and site factors important? Bulk reducing industry is an industry in which the inputs weigh more than the final product. Bulk gaining industry is an industry that makes something that gains falling during production. Ferrous item, it contains or consists of iron. Non-ferrous means not containing or consisting of iron. Breakable point is a location where a transfer is possible from one mode of transportation to another. A labor-intensive industry is an industry in which wages and other compensation paid to employees constitute a high percentage of expense. Situation and site factors determine where industries are located. Situation factors involve the transportation of materials to and from a factory. Site factors come from the unique characteristics of a location. Manufacturers will usually try to locate their factory close to their inputs and markets. A bulk-producing industry will make their factory next to their source of inputs to minimize transportation costs. Brands prefer their factories to be close to their customers. Minerals are important inputs for Earth's industries. 90% of Earth's crust is made of 8 out of 92 of the natural elements. Most of the minerals humans use are non-metallic. Metallic minerals have properties that are more valuable for fashioning machinery. Every metal has a different use. Ferrous metals include chromium, manganese, nickel, tin, and titanium. Non-ferrous metals include aluminum, copper, lead, magnesium, and zinc. An example of a bulk gaining industry is the fabrication of parts and machinery. Beverage bottling is another example of a bulk gaining industry. Single market manufacturers are manufacturers with only one or two customers. An example of a single market manufacturer is YKK, the world's largest manufacturer of zippers. Just-in-time parts are arrived as said just in time. The farther items are transported, the lower the cost per mile. The unloading expense is different for trucks, ships, trains, and planes. Methods of delivery are often mixed. Copper production involves many steps. Step 1 is mining. People will mine the copper ore. Step 2 is concentration. The ore is then crushed and grinded into fine particles. Step 3 is smelting. The concentrated copper then goes into smelters. Step 4 is refining. The purified copper is then treated at refineries. An important factor to consider when building a factory is energy. Steel was previously considered a luxury item until Henry Bessemer made a process for casting steel. Two changes in situation factors influenced change in the distribution of steel mills. The changes in the importance of the main inputs, the importance of being closer to markets rather than proximity to inputs. There has been a recent growth of steel mills in the U.S. However, rather than the input being iron and coal to make the steel, it is now scrap metal. Steel production has now become cheaper because of the input being scrap metal. Perishable product industries are located near markets. This is because people do not want stale, red, or spoiled milk. Perishable products are not always food. An example of a non-food perishable product is newspaper because it is dated information. From 2000 to 2010, publishing jobs declined from 1 million to 800,000. During that time, publishing jobs online increased from 70,000 to 80,000.
Key issue 3. Where does industry cause pollution? One of the biggest pollutants of air, water, and land is industry. Pollution is when more waste is added than air, water, and land resources can handle. We rely on air, water, and land to disperse and remove waste from factories and human activities. As a country's per capita increases, so does its per capita per carbon dioxide emissions. Air pollution is concentration of trace substances at a greater level than occurs in average air. High concentrations could affect people, plants, and animals. Air pollutants are generated from factories, power plants, and motor vehicles. There are 3 scales of air pollution: global, regional, and local. At a global scale, global warming could occur and it could damage the atmosphere's ozone layer. Earth gets warmed by sunlight that passes through the atmosphere, strikes the surface, and is converted into heat. When the heat tries to pass back through, some gets through and some gets trapped. This keeps a steady temperature and it allows life. Concentration of these gases in the atmosphere blocks or delays the return of some of the heat leaving the surface needed for space, and this raises the temperature overall. When we burn fossil fuels, carbon dioxide is discharged into the atmosphere, and plants and oceans absorb most of it. In the past 200 years, carbon dioxide levels have increased by 1/4. The greenhouse effect is the anticipated increase in Earth's temperature caused by carbon and other greenhouse gases trapping in some of the radiation. Global warming of only a few degrees can melt the polar ice sheets, raise the levels of the oceans, which would flood cities like New York, LA, and more deserts would receive rainfall, and Currently productive agricultural regions could become too dry for farming. Earth's atmosphere contains a zone 15 to 50 kilometers above the Earth called the stratosphere, which contains a concentration of ozone gas.
Ozone gas absorbs dangerous UV rays from the sun that causes skin cancer, damages plants, or disrupts food chains. Earth's protective ozone layer is threatened by pollutants called chlorofluorocarbons. At a regional scale, industry causes air pollution which damages a region's vegetation and water supply through acid deposition, and the world's three principal industrial regions are especially affected by it. Acid deposition is sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides emitted by burning fossil fuels, and they enter the atmosphere which they combine with oxygen and water, and they form tiny droplets, and this returns to the Earth's surface. Acid precipitation is when acid deposition is dissolved in water. It may fall as snow, rain, fog, or even dust, carried hundreds of kilometers before it reaches the surface. This damages lakes, fish, plants, and the soil around it. Acid precipitation also damages buildings and monuments made from marble. The worst damage is not located where the emissions originated because it is carried hundreds of miles before it reaches the surface. At a local scale, air pollution is severe in places where emission sources are concentrated, like in urban areas where there are lots of motor vehicles and factories. Three components of local-scale air pollution is carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, and particulates. Carbon monoxide impairs vision and reduces oxygen level in blood. Hydrocarbons cause smog, and particulates are smoke from cars. 4 pounds of solid waste is wasted per day per person in the U.S., 60% from residents and 40% from businesses. The most common way to dispose solid waste is sanitary landfills. More than one-half of the country's waste is trucked to landfills and buried under soil. The number of landfills in the U.S. has declined by 3/4 since the 1990s because there's a shortage of space. One alternative is to burn the trash because it reduces the bulk by 3/4 and it demands less space. Some manufacturers, such as the aluminum industry, are heavy users of water that may pollute it daily. Water pollution sources can be divided into point sources and non-point sources. Point source pollution enters a body of water at a specific location. Point source pollution is smaller in quantity and easy to control. An example of this could be discharged water from wastewater treatment plants. Non-point sources comes from a large diffused area. Non-point sources pollute in greater quantities and they are harder to control. An example of this could be excess fertilizers or herbicides and insecticides from agricultural lands. Water pollution has a bad impact on water and aquatic life. And now introducing our special guest, Sophia Matthews, here to talk about Key Issue 4.
In Chapter 11, Key Issue 4, it states that the industry shifts away from its industrial areas. The U.S. has always shifted from the Northeast to the Southwest. The Northeast U.S. has lost around 6 million jobs from around 1950 to 2010. Conditions for interregional shifts. Manufacturing has diffused into industrial centers while convergent areas have experienced a loss of jobs. Meanwhile, Western Europe has the most manufacturing job loss. Then there is the new International Division of Labor. High-skilled jobs remained in developed countries. Mexico, NAFTA, which meant the North American Free Trade Agreement. There was trade barriers, which meant the border, lower wages, and poor working conditions. They weren't also as cheap as India and China, which meant Mexico was losing jobs. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, and South Africa had controlled 1/4 of the area land. There was 3 billion people, and 1/6 of them world GDP. China has been told it will have the largest economy around 2020. China and India have the largest labor forces. Russia, Brazil were very rich in inputs.